Boston, Massachusetts, 1765. 2 years had passed since Samuel Adams stood at the harbor and made his quiet decision. 2 years of letters written by candlelight. 2 years of conversations in taverns and kitchens and churchyards. 2 years of slow, patient, dangerous work. And now the thing he had feared was here. The Stamp Act had arrived. John Hancock read the notice 3 times before he put it down. He was 30 years old, the wealthiest man in Boston. His warehouses lined the harbor. His ships carried goods from London to the Caribbean to the coast of Massachusetts. He had everything a man could want, and Parliament had just reached into his pocket. Every document his business produced would now be taxed. Every contract, every bill of sale, every shipping manifest, every piece of paper that kept his empire running would now carry the mark of the British crown. He sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling of his fine office. He thought about his uncle Thomas, who had built this business from nothing, who had worked every day of his life so that John would never have to struggle the way Thomas had struggled. Parliament had not asked Thomas Hancock's permission either. John Hancock stood up, straightened his coat, and walked out of his office. He was going to find Samuel Adams. The streets of Boston were different now. Adams could feel it as he walked, a tension in the air that had not been there before. Men gathered in small groups outside the taverns and the print shops, talking in low urgent voices. Women stood in doorways, arms crossed, listening. Even the children seemed quieter than usual. The Stamp Act had done something that no amount of speech-making could have accomplished. It had made the anger personal. It was one thing to talk about liberty and representation in the abstract. It was another thing entirely to hold a piece of paper in your hands and know that a king 3,000 miles away had decided to tax it without asking you. Every man in Boston who had ever signed a document understood now. Every merchant, every lawyer, every printer, every tavern keeper who posted his weekly menu on the wall. They all understood. Paul Revere was at his workbench when Adams found him. The silversmith's shop smelled of metal and fire. Revere was bent over a piece of silver, his hands moving with practiced precision. He looked up when Adams came in, read his friend's expression, and set down his tools. "You've seen the notices?" Revere said. It was not a question. Adams nodded. Revere wiped his hands on his apron and leaned against the workbench. "What are we going to do?" Adams was quiet for a moment. He looked around the shop, at the gleaming pieces of silver on the shelves, at the tools hanging on the wall, at the portrait of Revere's father looking down from above the door. His father had come to this country from France with nothing, had built a life here with his own hands, had raised a son who was now one of the finest craftsmen in New England. All of that, built by one man, with his own hands, in a land that had promised him freedom, and Parliament had just decided to tax his son's paperwork. "We are going to make them regret this," Adams said quietly. The meeting that night at the Green Dragon Tavern was larger than usual. Word had spread through the city the way word always spread in Boston, from neighbor to neighbor, from shop to shop, from church step to church step. By the time Adams arrived, the tavern was packed. Merchants and craftsmen and lawyers and printers, all crowded together in the smoky warmth, all talking at once. Adams stood at the front of the room and waited. Slowly, the talking died down. He looked out at the faces before him. These were not soldiers. They were not noblemen. They were ordinary men. A silversmith, a brewer, a printer, a rope maker, a merchant. Men who had built their lives with their own hands and asked for nothing but to be left in peace. "Parliament," Adams said, "has made a mistake." The room was very quiet, not because they underestimated us. He paused, but because they never bothered to know us. He let that sit for a moment. "They think we are subjects. They think we will bow our heads and pay our taxes and thank them for the privilege of being governed. They think that because we are far away, we are weak, because we are scattered, we cannot organize, because we have never fought back before, we never will." He placed his hands on the table in front of him. "We are going to show them how wrong they are." The room erupted. Outside, Boston Harbor lay cold and still. The British warships sat at anchor, their lights reflected in the dark water. On the decks, British sailors went about their evening duties, unaware of what was being decided in a tavern on Union Street. In London, Parliament was congratulating itself on a clever piece of legislation. In Boston, Samuel Adams was building a revolution. 3 days later, the first Sons of Liberty gathered under the Liberty Tree. It was a large elm tree near Boston Common that had stood for more than a century. The Sons of Liberty had chosen it as their symbol. Ancient, rooted, impossible to move. There were 9 of them at first: a distiller, a printer, a jeweler, a painter, a ship captain, a merchant, a brazier, a master mason, and Samuel Adams, who had never been particularly good at business, but was very, very good at this." They shook hands in the cold morning air beneath the bare branches of the Liberty Tree. They did not have weapons. They did not have money. They did not have the backing of any government or institution or powerful man. They had something more dangerous than any of those things. They had an idea, and the idea was this: that the people of these colonies had rights, that those rights could not be taken away by a king who had never met them, that taxation without representation was not just unfair, it was tyranny, and tyranny, Samuel Adams believed with every fiber of his being, had to be resisted. The 9 men stood beneath the Liberty Tree and made their quiet, world-changing decision. They would resist, whatever it cost, however long it took, they would resist. That evening, Samuel Adams walked home through the streets of Boston. The city was quieter now, the taverns were still lit, the voices still murmuring inside. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The harbor wind moved through the streets, cold and sharp. Adams stopped at the corner of his street and looked back toward the harbor. The lights of the British warships blinked in the darkness. He thought about what he had set in motion, about the 9 men under the Liberty Tree, about the faces in the tavern, about Paul Revere wiping his hands on his apron and asking what they were going to do. He thought about his wife Elizabeth, waiting at home, about the cold tea on the kitchen table, about the papers spread out before him in the early morning darkness, about 5 words that had started all of this: no taxation without representation. He said them one more time, quietly, to the empty street. Then he turned and walked home. The revolution was no longer just an idea. It had become something real, something that could not be stopped. Episode 3 continues. The fire is spreading.